Shift Happens Podcast.
Welcome to the Shift Happens Podcast, where we explore the latest trends and technologies transforming the future of work. In this episode, we have best-selling author Jacob Morgan joining me. Jacob has written 5 books, including his latest on the future of leadership called Leading with Vulnerability. We'll dig into his wisdom around the evolving dynamic between leaders and employees, the importance of bringing competence and connection together, and practical tips for leading with vulnerability in today's hybrid work environment. Stay tuned for our insightful conversation.
Shift Happens Podcast. Shift Happens Podcast.
Hey, Jacob, welcome to Shift Happens. It's so awesome to finally have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
So, Jacob, I tune into your podcast, read some of your books, but for those who haven't met you or know you, can you share a brief background of who you are, why you do what you do?
Sure. So as you alluded to, my name is Jacob Morgan. I have written several books. My 5th one, Leading with Vulnerability, is the one that's just out now. And besides that, I host a podcast. I have a Substack. I create a lot of content on themes related to leadership, the future of work, and employee experience. I've been doing this for about 15 years, and I'm a professionally trained futurist. I give a lot of keynotes for organizations around the world. And like I said, I create a lot of content. And I got into this because I had bad jobs working for other people. So 15 years ago, I left my last corporate full-time job, and I've been on my own ever since. And my goal is always to create great leaders, engaged employees, and future-ready organizations. So
let's talk about 15 years ago. What was the pivot? Is there a moment in time that you just realized, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to be on my own and help others to be better leaders and to have better organizations?
Oh yeah, there's a very specific moment. And the specific moment was that I worked for a company in Los Angeles in downtown LA. And keep in mind, I graduated with honors. I double majored in economics and psychology. I went to the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I was interviewing for a lot of organizations. And one of the companies I was interviewing, they told me I'd be doing these amazing projects and fun work and meeting with executives and entrepreneurs. And so I took the job. I had a 3-hour daily commute to and from work. But of course, I took the job because I was sold this vision of what it would be like to work there. And a few months into my job, I'm doing data entry and cold calling and PowerPoint presentations. And the pivotal moment for me was when the CEO came out of his beautiful corner office and he says, "I am late for a meeting and I need you to go to Starbucks and get me a latte. Here's $10. And after that, I was like, what am I doing here? This is why I went to school, is to get you a cup of coffee. That was a very pivotal moment for me.
So since then, right, fast forward 15 years, and through these 15 years, you've written a lot of books around work and the employee experience and leadership. Has that changed? Have you noticed similar experiences across organizations? And what are the key trends and forces shaping, especially work today?
Yeah, I think the trends are very, very consistent in terms of what we're looking at and what we see. So a few books ago, I think it came out in 2017, I wrote The Employee Experience Advantage, which basically said that if you want to create a place where employees want to work, you really just have 3 environments that you could focus on. Culture, which is how employees feel. Technology, which is the tools employees have access to do their jobs. And the spaces in which they work. That hasn't changed. That remains very consistent. My previous book was The Future Leader, which looked at mindsets and skill sets for future leaders. I don't think anything there has changed. And with the new book, which is out, it's called Leading with Vulnerability. This, I think, is a very new concept, which looks at how to bring together being vulnerable with this realm of competence and bringing that into your organization. It seems like you were asking about just general trends, like what's going on in the world of work, right?
Yes.
I mean, the big one that's a little disturbing to me is that it seems like employees want more and they want to do less, which drives me nuts. And this is coming from somebody who wrote a book on employee experience. But it seems like during the pandemic, the balance of power has shifted very much into the hands of employees. And I think a lot of employees took advantage of it. Meaning and I'm not saying that it was wrong for them to do so because it can be argued that for a long time, organizations were taking advantage of their people. So employees took advantage. They knew that companies were struggling for talent, and they took advantage. They tried to grab as much as they can. So they asked for higher salaries. They asked for more equity. They wanted to make more than their boss's boss. They wanted better benefits. And on top of everything, they didn't even want to show up to work anymore. And organizations gave all these things to employees. And I think we're at a state now where the pendulum has swung too much in that direction, to the point where you see organizations like the United Auto Workers Union, where they're asking for a 40% raise. They are asking for to get paid
4-day work week.
Yeah, a 4-day work week. But by the way, they want to get paid for 40 hours worth of work, but they only want to work 32 hours. And so I see and I hear about stuff like that. And by the way, there's trending things on TikTok called lazy girl jobs, the Sunday scaries. There's all these themes of like, well, you shouldn't really have to work hard on Monday. You should kind of ease into your work week. And, maybe you start working hard on Wednesday and then ease out of the work week on Friday. And it kind of just feels like a lot of people have gotten lazy and don't want to work anymore. I'm not saying everybody, but it just feels like it's hard to get good quality work. The work ethic that we once used to have, and I come from immigrant parents. Like, I'm not ashamed to admit it. I worked my ass off, right? I had a full-time job, and then I had a side job to be able to do what I'm doing now. And it feels, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, but to me, it feels like our sense of hard work and work ethic and doing what we need to do and not blaming other people and making sacrifices to get to where we want to get to is lost. And that very much annoys me and bothers me. But we're starting to see a little bit of a reversal, because if you look at it, a lot of companies are going through layoffs now. We have very uncertain economic times ahead of us. And so for a company that is considering to lay off employees, you have to imagine, who are the employees that they're going to lay off? They're going to lay off the employees who asked for more and took more. So if the company knows that you're making way more than you should be making, you asked for way more than you should be getting, you're going to be the first one to get out of that company. And then when you go apply for a new job, you're not going to get that same salary anymore. You're not going to get that same package, those same benefits, those same perks. So you're going to go through a little bit of a rebalancing that I think we're going to see. And it's funny, a lot of companies are now saying, employees, get back to the office. And I'm a big believer in hybrid work. But the outrage that employees are showing to their employers, who, mind you, are paying them to do a job and paying for their benefits, and the fact that an employee is now saying, how dare you ask me to go into work? I'm just, I can't handle that.
So first and foremost, Jacob, I love that you just dove into the deep end, because I'm on the same page with you. One of the things that I love about the United States, I'm an immigrant. I came here in 1996. It's this idea of you work hard, you put in a good day's work. I'm not even talking about working 80 hours a week, then you will be rewarded. And it has been that for the longest time. And it still is today. Now, you're right. Something happened during the pandemic. And it's true, where there was a time and juncture where we have to take care of people. And indeed, the pendulum has swung all the way to the other side. But I want to break it down further and maybe explore this idea. Do you think, number one, is it generational? Is it cultural? Because, this getting paid more, work less, being lazy, as you put it, is it because we're just seeing it today? Because maybe in other cultures, sometimes I joke with my colleagues in Europe, like, boy, you guys have it really good. You have a lot of vacations and you have all these pro-employee benefits that comes from the government, whereas here in the United States, we don't. But then at the same time, you talk about return to office. My colleagues in Asia Pacific, some of them even goes back 5 days a week happily, right? So what are your thoughts around this? Is it the industry, the generation, cultural, and what are you seeing with the different types of organizations as well?
Some of it is, I think, in fact, there was actually a couple of articles that were written where organizations said that they were preferring to hire older workers because the older workers had a work ethic and they feel that younger employees don't. And, part of it, I think, is a lot of what we're seeing on social media, where people are putting up, there's videos of what it's like. I think Google was one of them, where people take videos of their typical workday, and there was one of like a girl, right, some young lady. She
It
goes
was
up.
LinkedIn. I think that was LinkedIn or somewhere. Yeah.
Maybe it was LinkedIn, and she's like, "Oh, here's a typical day for me. Like, I show up to work at like 9. I grab a latte. I go sit in my relaxing chair. I go sit in the sun. Maybe I go check an email. Oh, then it's lunchtime. Then I take my dog for a walk." And I'm looking at that, thinking like, what planet are you on? That not only would you record this video and put it up, which if I were that employer, I would say, "You're done here. Like, why are we paying you?" But a lot of people see that stuff. And they say, "Oh, well, why am I working so hard?" Now, again, that's part of it. Second part is, look, I'm a millennial. I grew up watching my mom be miserable at her job. She would come home from work crying, and she quit her job. So I grew up believing that nobody should have to work for an organization that takes advantage of you. But at the same time, I also grew up believing and understanding that if you work for a company and you feel that it's not a good fit, go work somewhere else. Go build something yourself. I left because I did not like the corporate world, and I went to go build and create something on my own. So I don't I don't like the approach that a lot of people are taking of, I'm working for a company and I'm unhappy, and I'm just going to make a big deal about how unhappy I am and why I'm so unhappy, but I'm not going to give you any solutions to the problems. Right? That's the victim card. The victim card and the victim mentality drives me nuts. Right? And I grew up, my dad always said, nobody cares about your problems. Nobody cares about the things that you're unhappy about. You either work at that company and do what you need to do, or quit, go work somewhere else, or go build something go build something on your own. And I actually had several stories of CEOs that I interviewed where they would tell me that they've been in situations where they too hated their jobs. They worked for leaders who would take advantage of them, who would take credit for their work, who would scream at them in front of their peers. But they still stuck through it, and they did such a good job in their role that their evil, mean bosses eventually got fired, and they replaced their boss. And it's because they stuck around that they became CEOs of the company. So there needs to be a little bit of thick skin approach brought back to organizations. I don't like the coddling. I don't like the, woe is me. It drives me freaking nuts. And again, I wrote a book on employee experience. So I'm not saying that the organization has the right to treat you poorly. I think a company should create leaders where, that you can learn from, that are coaching and mentoring you. I think you should be given the opportunities for advancement. I think you should be given the tools and resources to get your job done. You should be getting the training that you need, and you should be treated with respect and dignity, and you should have a hybrid work environment. But look, you got hired because the company needed help with something, and you said that you could help them. That's like the very basic foundational relationship between an employee and an employer. And so I think that we're going to see a rebalancing, and we're already starting to see that. But it's very, very frustrating and annoying for me to see that. And so I think, to your point, some of it is cultural, some of it is driven by social media and technology. I think some of it is driven by what we've seen post-pandemic, as far as a lot of institutions, especially in the United States, giving people free money to not have to do anything. And we've, I think, created a culture, and we've created an environment where we don't reward and prioritize hard work anymore for a lot of people. Like, what's the incentive for you to work hard now? And again, I think we need to get back to that.
I fully agree. And as such, right, we're seeing also, as you said, because of technology, where on the flip side is providing more equity, because now we're seeing in typical places or typical areas that roles weren't available, but because of technology and because of hybrid work, now it's becoming available. So that's one of the good things. It's competition's opening up more, if you want to put it that way, and opportunities are opening up more for people around the world, which is great.
I don't believe there's any substitute for hard work. I interviewed Mark Randolph, the former CEO of Netflix, and he had these rules that he came up with for himself. And one of the rules he came up with was always do 10% more than what is asked. I'm a big believer in that. But it seems like in today's environment, we want to do 20% less than what is expected instead of 10% more than what is asked. And I think the people who are willing to work hard, the people who are willing to make the occasional sacrifice, the people who are willing to go above and beyond, I think are always going to have a place in the business world. And the people who are constantly looking and trying to justify why they can't work hard or, why they're struggling and stuff like that. It's hard to look. My parents came to the States. They had no money. They didn't speak any English. My dad lived in low income housing in New Jersey. And he practiced speaking English by watching the Johnny Carson and Merv Griffin shows with a Russian translation English dictionary. So and again, context matters, right? So that's how I grew up, where nobody's feeling sorry for me. Like I would come home to my parents and talk about problems and challenges, and they'd be like, I'm not going to curse on your show, but they'd say, too freaking bad. Like, go figure it out.
Go figure it out. Yeah, right? Exactly.
Yeah. And it's the immigrant mentality. And I wish that more people had that immigrant mentality.
Yeah. Well, have you read the work of Angela Duckworth? Her work around grit.
Grit, yes. I think we need more of that.
Yes. And I believe that every organization, every employee, and every leader should read that, because she shares a lot of practical guidance on how do you hone grit. And it's not like sending people to boot camps, but there are ways to do it. So along that lines, right, knowing the situation we're in now, what advice do you have for leaders or strategies to implement this environment where people are encouraged to work hard, but at the same time, make it an equitable experience and not this mindset around, it's us versus them, right? And moving towards this place where there's a goal everybody's trying to get to, not only for the organization, but for individuals as well.
Well, the new book that just came out is called Leading with Vulnerability, which I know after what I just said, some people might be saying, well, that doesn't sound very vulnerable. But hear me out. A vulnerability is this idea where you say or do something that exposes you to the potential of emotional harm, right? Risk, uncertainty, emotional exposure, as Brené Brown famously said. And in our personal lives, I think it's very clear why vulnerability is important. It creates connection, it builds bonds, it creates trust with those around us. But what about inside of a company where you have a different dynamic? You have hierarchy, you have a boss, you have employees, leaders, customers, projects, deadlines, and the issue of money. Is vulnerability inside of a company really the same as it is in your personal life? And what if you're a leader of a team? You're a leader of a company. Is vulnerability for you the same as it is for everybody else? And so I talked to 100 CEOs. I surveyed 14,000 employees with a leadership firm called DDI. And it became very apparent that leadership, that vulnerability inside of a company and for leaders is not the same as it is for everybody else. So the big thing that I always advocate for people is don't be vulnerable at work. I think it can hurt you far more than it can help you. And again, vulnerability inside of a company is this idea of doing or sharing something that can potentially expose you to emotional harm. So maybe you talk about a mistake or a challenge, and somebody takes that information and they say, hey, Jacob's never done that before. He shouldn't be on this project. And now I get demoted, or now I get put on a different project. So inside of a company, vulnerability is basically you're showing a gap that you have, a gap in understanding, a gap in capability. Maybe you're feeling unsure about something. Maybe you're struggling with something at home, but whatever it is, you're sharing that you have a gap, something that you are trying to figure out. Leading with vulnerability is showing the gap, but demonstrating what you're trying to do to close the gap on your own. So a very simple and practical example. You give me a project to do, I mess it up. And I show up to work and I say, I am so sorry I screwed this project up. That's vulnerability. All right, I'm showing you the gap. I didn't do a good job. That's the gap. Leading with vulnerability is I show you the gap. Now, how am I trying to close the gap? I'm going to say, here's what I learned from my mistake. Here are 3 things that I'm going to do going forward to make sure that mistake doesn't happen again. That's important because you as my leader or my peers, they want to know that I'm there because I can do the job that I was put in the position to do. And so if you just show up to work every day talking about your mistakes and challenges and failures and struggles and feelings, one day people are going to look at you and they're going to say, maybe this isn't a good fit. So it's not that vulnerability is bad, but vulnerability on its own can hurt you. Combine vulnerability with leadership. These are 2 important pillars because vulnerability is where connection comes from. And leadership is where competence comes from. And for me, the mark of a good leader is somebody who is able to both connect with employees, but also demonstrate that they're good at their job. And that, I think, is best piece of advice. And it kind of relates to what we talked about earlier, because we're very good, or not very good, but we've been taught, and we have a lot of conversations about vulnerability at work. But we forget that we also need to add the leadership piece at work.
This is fantastic. It reminds me of Kim Scott's book, Radical Candor, which I'm sure you came across, where she talked about this concept of caring personally, but challenging directly, right? Where, to your point, in the past couple of years, the idea of being more open, more vulnerable is great. But then what's the context, right? Is it more along the lines of the personal, emotional side, which is perfectly fine if you have a really close and trust relationship. But from a work perspective, boxing it around what we're working on, the projects, people we engage with, and things we need to achieve. I think having that context is critical. And certainly it can help not only the leaders, but also the team they're leading as well.
Yeah, there needs to be intention behind vulnerability. And so again, I call this the vulnerable leader equation, which is vulnerability plus leadership equals leading with vulnerability. So in any situation where vulnerability is going to be present, or where you need to be vulnerable, try to ask yourself what you can do to bring in a little bit of leadership in there. What can you do to demonstrate that you're trying to close the gap, that you're trying to get better or learn and grow? That, I think, is going to make a huge difference, not only in your individual career, but also in the team dynamic, in the business, and in the corporation's overall dynamics. Because imagine a scenario where everybody in the company is not just okay with exposing the gap, but they're taking the accountability and demonstrating how they're trying to close that gap themselves. It doesn't mean other people won't help you, but you need to be the owner of solving your own problem. On my team, and I know you have a team as well, people make mistakes all the time. I make mistakes, my team makes mistakes. But as a leader, when somebody comes to you and they say, hey, I'm sorry I messed this up, you're kind of like, it's okay. But in the back of your mind, you're like, I don't care. Like, I don't care that you messed this up. You were supposed to do it and you didn't do it. So on my team, when somebody makes a mistake, I say, okay, thank you for telling me. What did you learn from the mistake that you made? I want to know, what was the lesson that you took away? You botched something. Maybe we lost a deal. A video didn't turn out the way that it was supposed to. What did you learn from the mistake that you made? How are you going to make sure this mistake doesn't happen again in the future? So I'm not just concerned with the fact that somebody pointed out the mistake. That's great. I'm also interested in, how are we going to make sure it doesn't happen again? Like if somebody on my team says, hey, Jacob, I need help with this. I say, great, I'm happy to help you. But in the future, what are you going to do to help yourself? Because if you keep coming to me for everything, I become the bottleneck and it slows everything down. So I'm happy to help you, but also tell me what you're going to do to help yourself going forward. And I think that, again, it's the leadership piece to the vulnerability that we need to focus on.
So let me ask you this. Why do you think that second part doesn't happen as much? So the part where, okay, I'm going to help you, but what are you going to do about it? What did you learn? I feel like that's not common in a lot of leaders, and frankly, not even leaders, right? Even individual. Yeah. So why do you think it's not? Is it just because people aren't taught? It's not innate. It's not obvious. To me, it's obvious, but at the same time, I think about even myself in the past or people I work with. That's not the common response, where they'll just say, hey, we messed this up, moving along, right? And then we mess it up again the next time.
Yep, exactly. We mess it up again and we don't talk about what we learned, how we're going to keep it from happening again, none of that stuff. Same thing if you're exposing a personal challenge that you're struggling with at home. Again, you first understand why you're doing that with and who you're doing it with at work, but also the people that you're working with are going to want to know, well, are you doing something about it? Right? I mean, even if you're sharing a personal challenge or struggle, you can still also demonstrate what you're trying to do to solve your problem, regardless of what that challenge is, right? Maybe you're a heavy smoker or you're trying to lose weight, right? You don't just want to show up to work and say, oh my goodness, I am smoking, I'm coughing all the time, or I'm so overweight, this is terrible. But also, so here's what I'm doing. I'm going to start eating healthy. I'm going to start doing, like, people want to know that you have that ownership over yourself and your path and your direction. And then other people are more comfortable to give you advice and feedback and suggestions and have that dialogue for you. But if you just show up and you just kind of spill your guts out onto people, it's very uncomfortable. not just for you, but for those around you. So why don't we do more of this? I think for a few reasons. Number one, we don't talk about it enough. I think we've been very obsessed focusing on vulnerability over the past few years that we forgot about the leadership piece. And so now what happens is a lot of people are trying to use vulnerability as a way to justify poor performance. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't have the time for this. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't have the budget for this. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going through a hard time. That's why I couldn't get this project done. And so we're trying to use vulnerability as a way to justify why we're not getting things done. I think a second reason is because in our personal lives, we oftentimes don't need that second piece of the equation. Like if I'm talking to my wife or to a good friend of mine, it's okay for me to just say, hey, and Blake's my wife, and I say, Blake, I really had a bad day. Like I can do that because it's my wife and she'll be supportive and she'll ask me questions. I don't need to have that level of leadership there. But again, it's a different dynamic. Blake doesn't work for me. She's not dependent on me for a deadline or for a project or something like that. She's not paying me anything. So I can say that. It's a different dynamic. At work, it's a different environment. So I think that's another reason. And third, so we actually surveyed 14,000 employees and we asked them, what's the number one reason why you don't want to be vulnerable at work? And the response is actually the answer. The number one response came back as, I don't want to be perceived as being weak and incompetent. And it's funny because you don't want to be perceived as being weak or incompetent, but that's what happens when you're only vulnerable, right? Obviously, if you keep showing up each day and I'm having a tough time, I'm struggling, I failure, mistake, obviously you're going to create this aura and perception around yourself that you're incompetent. So the answer to that is what we've talked about, which is add competence, add the leadership. If you don't want to be perceived as being incompetent, then demonstrate that you're either competent or are trying to get competent. So again, I made a mistake. Here's what I learned. I need help. Here's what I'm going to do to figure it out going forward in the future. Right? Demonstrate the competence whenever you can when there's vulnerability, and that's going to change other people's perception of you when it comes to vulnerability. And then all of a sudden people will say, oh, well, Jacob told me he made a mistake, but he really took ownership over it. Jacob really demonstrated that he learned something from it, and he actually came up with some things that he's going to do going forward that we're going to implement that not only is going to help Jacob, I think it's going to help the team too. Like you get that sense of competence, that sense of leadership. Add that to your vulnerability piece. And just remember the vulnerable leader equation. Leadership plus vulnerability equals leading with vulnerability. Two pieces: leadership, vulnerability, competence, connection.
That's fantastic. And, certainly with the remaining time we have, right? If you can take it further and put it in an operational model, combining it with what you described earlier, where, organizations leveraging technology and now with the hybrid work model, how would this look like operationally day to day? Like walk us through a day in the life with leading with vulnerability, from things like, okay, I go to work, I do a meeting, or I'm growing a team, I'm working with a global organization. How would that look like?
Well, it depends on the situation or the circumstance, right? I mean, let's say you're in a meeting, for example, and you get called on in a meeting and you don't know the answer. So in that situation, in my mind, I would already be thinking of, okay, I'm going to be put in a vulnerable spot. I was just asked something. I have no freaking clue what the answer is. So obviously, I'm going to be in a vulnerable spot and I'm going to have to say, I don't know. And in the back of my mind, I'm going to be thinking, okay, how do I add leadership to that? How do I add something so that the people in the room and so that my leader don't think that I'm incompetent? And so if you called on me and said, hey, Jacob, we're doing this strategic business initiative, we need your feedback on that. What do you think? Being vulnerable, I would say, that's a good question, man. I got no idea. Leading with vulnerability, I would say, you know what? I'm not sure. Give me until the end of tomorrow. I'm going to schedule a couple interviews with some key members of our team who are running these different pieces of the business unit. I'm going to go collect some data from our analytics department, and I'm going to put together something, and let me present it to you tomorrow by the end of the day. Again, that's better than just saying, I don't know. Bring in the leadership whenever you can, right? It's whenever you know that vulnerability is going to be present, ask yourself, when possible, how do I add that leadership piece? That's in the example of a meeting. I mean, you can use it in pretty much any scenario, right? Another example, let's say I just got promoted today. I show up to work and everybody says, "Hey, Jacob, congratulations. You are now going to be a first-time manager. Here's your team. Why don't you say a couple words?" Right? We see that happen a lot. Being vulnerable, I could go in front of my team and say, "Oh, thank you so much for this promotion. I'm so excited to be leading this team. I know I've never done this before. I'm a little nervous about it, but I'm confident that we're going to get some awesome things going forward, and we're going to have some really great projects, and we're going to have lots of success." Now, if I'm working for that kind of a leader, in the back of my mind, I'm going to be like, I don't know how I feel about this. I kind of feel like I could do that job. Why did Jacob get it? So instead, if I know I'm going to have to address something to my team, same scenario, I would come in and I'd say, "Hey, I'm super excited to be leading this team. I know and I recognize that I'm a first-time leader and this is not something that I've done before. So here's what I'm going to do. I actually reached out to one of the executives at this company who's going to be coaching and mentoring me and overseeing some of the stuff that I'm going to be doing for the first 90 days. I'm also going to be working with an executive coach who's going to be giving me some feedback on my leadership style. And by the way, here are 3 leadership books that I have found which were recommended to me that I'm going to be reading. I encourage you to read along with me and give me feedback and suggestions on what I can do to be the best leader that you've ever had." Now, all of a sudden, I'm thinking, okay, I got it. First-time leader, Jacob, but he's clearly doing something to close the gap. He's demonstrated, wow, he's got a mentor at the company. He's got an executive coach. He's putting in the time. Likely he's having to put in extra time on his own time outside of work to do this. Yeah, I feel like I can give Jacob a chance. I feel like he's doing something to demonstrate that leadership piece. So again, the context matters, but I think throughout the day, it is important. And I'm not saying that there's never going to be a situation where you might just, have to share a little bit of vulnerability. I'm not saying that you need to always walk around and say, "I learned this," and don't be a robot and have it.
I'm going to do that, right?
But again, you just need to use a little bit of self-awareness to understand the situations and the context, who you're speaking with, and to try to demonstrate whenever you can that you're trying to take action. Because you're not just taking action for yourself. The action that you take is going to be reflected on the team. It'll be reflected on the leader. It'll be reflected on the business and on the company. So you want to always try to demonstrate that inside of your company, that you're moving forward, creating that progress, and trying to help yourself and everyone around you, especially if you want to become a leader and grow in your career.
Well, Jacob, this is fantastic. It gives me a good preview of your keynote in our upcoming Shift Happens conference. I got to tell you, this conference is something that we brought back in person after 4 years. That's me being vulnerable. But we made sure we did a lot of promotions, invited a lot of great speakers, and talked to a lot of customers around the area to make sure they join us in the next 2 weeks. So looking forward to see you to do the keynote on leading with vulnerability.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It should be a lot of fun. And I know we're going to have books out there, which will be really cool. So hopefully people listening and watching will be able to attend. If not, so we created a special URL called leadwithvulnerability.com. So people can go there. And then if they want to see some of the CEO interviews that I did for the book, if they grab a copy and email bonus@thefutureorganization.com, we'll send them 5 of those interviews. And then we're also going to be putting up some of the content and the research on my Substack, which is greatleadership.substack.com. So they can go there and see some of the stuff.
Well, awesome. Jacob, this is a great conversation, and looking forward to see you. And for everybody who wants to connect with you and follow with you, where can they best connect with you? Is it on LinkedIn, Twitter, everywhere?
I'm everywhere. So if they go to thefutureorganization.com, that's my personal website, and I got links to all the social icons there. But yeah, LinkedIn has been great. I mean, I love LinkedIn. I use it a lot, but I'm also on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, but LinkedIn's probably the best place.
Well, thank you, Jacob. Thank you, everybody, for tuning into this episode of Shift Happens. And make sure you follow Jacob and check out his new book, Leading with Vulnerability. Until the next episode, thank you.
Shift Happens Podcast.
Thanks for listening. The key takeaway from this episode is the importance of leading with vulnerability, showing your gaps while also demonstrating competence and leadership. Vulnerability builds connection, while leadership builds confidence. By combining them, leaders can create trust and psychological safety on their teams. If you like today's episode, subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcast. See you next time.
Shift Happens Podcast. Shift Happens Podcast.